the value of Picasso as a brand. It's like saying you inherited Elvis Presley, the right to all of the intellectual property for Elvis, and you decide, look, this is going to be a lot of work. I think I'm just going to walk away. I'm going to sell what I have that he owned, and I'm going to move on. Nobody would do that because there were hundreds of millions of dollars if you decide to hang on, stay a hold of this tiger by the tail, so to speak.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to Life's Third Act. Today we're picking up with part 2 of the life, death, and thereafter of Picasso. So rich was this subject that we couldn't possibly cover it in one. And in fact, it's going to end up being 2 substantial segments, which we didn't intend to be as long, but we kind of let the subject matter carry us with it. So welcome to part 2 of Picasso's life, death, and thereafter. So he knew, and he made a conscious decision that he didn't want to do it. And so the story goes, those who were closest to him said that his position was that he felt that if he makes a will, it's going to somehow put into motion some not earthly forces. He didn't fear a conspiracy where somebody would kill him, but he felt in some ethereal, spiritual way, I don't know, that somehow doing this act will place into motion this chain of events where he would die sooner.
Very, very superstitious. And
yeah.
But
was he known for being superstitious?
Yeah, but it tracks with, I mean, like, he was an artist. Like, artists, you know, they're very spiritual. A lot of them are, and they're very like ethereal, like you were talking about. And so I think that everybody was surprised, but they weren't surprised at the same time because they were just kind of like, oh, you know, typical Picasso. And I think a lot of people probably think that too when it comes to their will, because I think they're like bringing like bad juju to themselves to plan out their end of life, which, I mean, it kind of feels that way, but you have to have it. You have to know where your possessions are going to be going. And especially if you're that big of an artist, you need to know who your art is going to, and that family that's so complicated also.
Yeah, and this, you're right, all those things, and it kind of leads to another point. Mm-hmm. It leads to the point, the uncomfortable point, that Picasso is really a bit of a narcissist.
Yes.
I mean, he was self-absorbed, and for someone to place their comfort, such as we've described, the superstitious concern, and to say that's going to outweigh what I know would be in the best interest of his family. He couldn't have questioned that it would have been much easier for his family, and maybe essential for his family, for all he knew, for him to take the care of doing this. This would be a selfless act.
Yeah.
And we don't see many selfless acts in Picasso's life that I can think of.
He knew his family didn't get along. None of them got along. His children got along with him, but they didn't get along with each other or all of the moms involved or
the stage was set.
That. Yeah. Yeah. He knew what he was doing. And I think he just wanted to watch it all go up in turmoil. I don't know.
As incriminating as that is that he just had other priorities.
Yeah.
And they were self-related, not them related.
Yeah.
Everything you build for you and your family deserves protecting. All of those important assets you have worked so hard to acquire and enjoy, you want to make sure they're handled with care. At Tucker Allen, our attorneys will customize an estate plan that will work for you and your family's goals and needs. Tucker Allen, estate planning, probate, and trust administration. Visit tuckerallen.com.
So I think that often whenever we have relatives and others who don't bother to do wills because it's too much trouble or for some superstitious fear, whatever the reasoning, and what they're in effect doing is choosing to put themselves, their lives and their satisfaction ahead of those they love. And that may seem harsh for some people we know, but I don't think it's harsh for Picasso, because Picasso, it'd be different if the rest of his life had been lived in a selfless way. Mm-hmm. And there may be some of those people who have a morbid fear relating to death, and they may not do a will, but yet they have a life of sacrifice. Picasso No. I mean, it was very self-indulgent. Yes, he supported his kids. I mean, so you can't say that he was mean-spirited in that way. But his life was very much about himself, and I think that has resulted in a situation where he dies without a will. Leaving again, and this is important here, leaving notoriously the setting that is going to release a chain of events that it would be years sorting out, and we're going to get into that. But I just want to be clear that for Picasso to have deliberately chosen, because it was uncomfortable to him to do a will, to let that happen really troubles me.
Yeah.
And it didn't have to end as well as it did. We're going to give you a good ending here, but Picasso couldn't have known that.
Yeah. And I think that is something that a lot of people just don't recognize about him. I think when you think artist, you think, somebody happy, somebody giving, somebody very cheerful, and like you said, selfless. But that's really not what we, come across in a lot of these stories, and in a lot of artists either. They're not always the best person. They might be the best painter, but they're not always the best person because they throw themselves into their work, and that's the only thing they care about.
Yeah, and clearly Picasso lived for his work, and he had great work.
Yes.
So anyway, let's talk about his death. So when he dies in 1973, there's no will. He has around his house thousands. I've seen 45,000.
Yeah.
I don't know if that includes some of the works that were sold. You get different, when you look at these different sources that we find, we get different numbers. So there's a little bit of lack of clarity, but one thing we know is that there was a ton of art to be gathered, and all that had to be authenticated.
Mm-hmm.
With him, it was less of a matter of authentication than it was other works that were floating around out there that still would have been within the estate because Picasso owned them. There were a lot of those that were around. They were in museums.
He didn't make it easy either because before his death, he lived in like 20 different places and would just bounce from place to place, leaving art behind. So he had he had 2 houses too and a chateau, I believe, and just left like all kinds of pieces. Before anybody wonders, how do you fit 45,000 pieces of art into one home? It was all over the place, which is why they had such a big deal authenticating it.
And I think there was a 4th home even.
Yeah, I think you're right.
There was a 4th property that he owned at the time of his death. He was wealthy. This is not an artist who just got by. This was one of those artist stories, and not all that common, where he was very wealthy at the time of his death. He was world famous. His older paintings, especially those from his earliest period, were selling at huge amounts of money. But so he was popular, in demand, world famous, and he just got more famous, and the paintings became more valuable. Ever since then, they're substantially more valuable today than they were then, and that's not the course of all art. Some people think, well, gee, if you have art that's worth money in 1960, it's going to be worth money in 2020. And that's not true. There are a lot of examples where things plummet.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't realize how kind of like auctions work is like the artist still has rights to the painting no matter where it's sold. So they still get a portion of the like however much it's valued or sold at. Because I think a lot of people think like, oh, if it's just sold to somebody, they own that, they, have the right to it. But no, the artist still has a right, which is how he was making all of that money off of those much older pieces.
Yeah. The reproduction, the continual reproduction results, as we've talked a little bit about on here, and this is a recurring theme, it seems like, is copyright law and patents. So in this case, there was a ton of assets, there was real estate that was worth several million. There were the paintings that, depending on what you read, I've read numbers as low as 250 million, and New York Times had an article that estimated $1 billion. I think the $1 billion estimate was probably from when we'll talk about an organization that was formed by the children a number of years later. I think that might have been taken from that period. But one thing about it, we know that as a practical matter, the value of this estate not just in terms of the pictures themselves, but all of the branding, all of the intellectual property associated with the reproduction of these works and the use of these works in movies and whatnot. I mean, all of that is generating continual income, and it's not diminished, it's gone up. So he's actually much more popular today than even when he died. So the effort to value the estate was hopeless, meaning they did come up with a number, and I think the number was something under $500 million, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was around there.
It was below $500 million, but realistically, it was $1 billion. And I agree with that with the New York Times article. So this creates a problem, a bunch of problems for estate planning. This is another thing. If I sound a little harsh on Picasso about being selfish regarding the interests of his family and really his legacy, is that his situation, more than most, was going to be an absolute catastrophe. Yes. And the reason is that when you die with assets that are in the form of paintings, then that's an asset that is not easily made liquid. And if you do make art, especially art that it represents a significant percentage of everything that's on the market at the time. So Picasso had, within his estate, a substantial portion of the total estate. Here's the analogy. If you own a substantial part of the outstanding stock of a company, and let's say it's a closely held company, your relative dies and you're a beneficiary, and it turns out that 30% or 25% of the outstanding stock of this company is owned by your uncle. So now you have the tax man cometh, and so the federal government says, well, gee, this is a lot of money, so you need to give us $200 million out of a $400 or $500 million estate. Well, where are you going to get $200 million? And incidentally, that's due in 9 months at most.
That's crazy.
So often, if you go ahead and sell those shares, it would be very unusual if that didn't cause a collapse in the share price. So suddenly, you're selling shares, and every block of shares that you sell push the value down for the next block. So by the time you have managed to get out of that, what might have started out as, say, $400 million ends up being a value of 100 or less. And that's exactly what would have happened with Picasso, meaning if they had to pay the tax bill at the time, and this is France, so it's France's system of taxation at the time. Remember, this is not the EU then. So the rate, you should know, at this time was close to 90%. Now, this is a marginal tax rate, so I would say that starts at a sufficiently low number to where probably the bulk of this would have been taxed at near 90%. Think about 90% tax. England had that for a while too, and maybe during the same period. That's the reason some of you know that the Rolling Stones album, Exile on Main Street, the Rolling Stones left in protest because the government was taking all their money. And they lived in France at the time. Come to think of it, I hadn't thought about this. So I don't know if France had in place the same law at the time. I have to believe they did.
Do they still have that?
Incidentally, I should distinguish this. This was the reason that's not inconsistent is we're talking about an income tax for the Rolling Stones. That was income tax related. And now we're talking about a state tax. So it could have been that France had a much lower income tax than England at the time, which I believe, but a much higher estate tax. A lot of countries believe. Thankfully, the U.S. is not an advocate so much of this, but there are countries who believe that fine, we won't take much of your income, but when you die, we don't want wealth passed from generation to another. We want to start afresh, so they take the bulk of the wealth. So anyway, so he passes away. Now they have all this money, and they have to pay this tax to France. So it was a nightmarish situation that could have dramatically reduced the value for a while of Picasso's art, because, ultimately the market, I think, would have recovered. But with no thanks to Picasso, incidentally, as to solving this problem, it turns out that after 6 years of litigation, they have $30 million plus in attorney fees. Now, this is attorney fees in the 70s. Yeah. So imagine $200 million. It's more than 3 times. It's probably $200 million today in attorney fees. So,
and in France too.
Yeah, and in France.
Yeah.
So you had attorney fees, you had all the other fees that were owed to various professionals that were involved. Imagine the appraisers, the art appraisers. You can't have one, you can't have two. No. I mean, you must have people from all over the world participate in order to be able to have a bona fide judgment about the value of these paintings. I mean, these are opinions, and it's art. So it's not like an opinion on real estate where you can look to income and determine, yeah, that's what this is worth. So they hire the family, of course, is arguing at the same time. So you have this team of experts who are burning through the estate. Meanwhile, you have France saying, look, we're entitled to a whole lot of money here. And you have the families arguing. So there was one characterization of this.
And there was a lot of illegitimate children coming forward.
Oh, yeah.
Mistresses and
we can't forget
all kinds of things.
The other claimants that came forward. Here was one summary. I think this from the Vanity Fair article. There were 1,885 paintings, 1,228 sculptures, 7,089 drawings, 30,000 prints, 150 sketchbooks, 3,222 ceramics, and then this doesn't include the illustrated books, the copper plates, the tapestries, and the things in some of the other homes. So, in addition, there was 1.3 million in gold, 4.5 million in cash, 4.5 million in cash in 1973. So Picasso, he definitely had he had the ability to have a lavish life, but I should say in his defense, it wasn't that lavish, meaning he stayed in these homes. They were nice homes. They were very nice homes. But, when you think of the way he could be a jet setter, he wasn't a jet setter.
No. And I wonder what I was just thinking about this over here, what that exchange rate would have been. Oh. Because this is in dollars, not.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right.
So I wonder if it would have been even higher in France.
Probably. So there were also stocks, bonds. Those values weren't made public. So it was a crisis for the heirs, in part because they knew that the law was going to allocate it equally to the heirs. So thankfully there wasn't that dispute, but they still had to dispense with all the claimants to be heirs. So all those people that you mentioned came forward, they had to deal with all those. But once those had been disposed of, and they were, but it took years, then you end up with these what would have been 4 children. One died not long, within 2 or 3 years after Picasso died. So you're left with 3 children, and then that deceased child's 2 children. But that was the way it's allocated. So 25% to each of the 3 kids and 12.5% to each of the 2 grandkids. And then they had to deal, though, with the IRS. So among the people that were involved with this was the president of France, which I know I'm going to butcher this, Giscard d'Estaing.
Yes.
So he was the president of France at the time. So he gets involved because, remember, this guy's a national treasure, and they know that this is going to swamp the stock, the market for all of Picasso's paintings, which at this point are all over the world. So with the intervention of these government employees, 2 government agencies, appraisers, catalogers, the attorneys, the state's attorneys, the government's attorneys, as well as the individual attorneys for each of the heirs, ultimately, through a series of meetings in 60 years, said they had 60 meetings with the heirs to resolve these things. They were deadlocked at various points. How do we solve this problem? Ultimately, the nation of France decides, look, we will take in kind the taxes. In kind means we will take art in exchange for the taxes. Well, it sounds like, that sounds like a nice thing to do. Well, it's not quite as selfless as it appears. Do you have that list?
Yes. So first I want to ask, do you think they got to go in and pick and choose what they got?
I'm sure there was much haggling.
Yeah.
I guarantee you they had appraisers who represented the Louvre. Even though this didn't go to the Louvre, they end up creating a museum strictly for Picasso's work consisting of this. but still, I'm sure they had the Louvre's best art appraisers going in and arguing with the appraisers representing the family.
That's what I was just imagining, like, how do you determine what they get? But here's what they got. So they got 203 paintings, 158 sculptures, 88 ceramics, nearly 1,500 drawings, more than 1,600 prints, and 33 sketchbooks. And then out of that, they formed the Picasso Museum in Paris, which is a wildly famous museum. And they still bring, like, through, tons of his art. They have, obviously, those pieces there, but all of the worldly art that travels, they still bring it through for big exhibitions and everything like that. But
wow,
I could not imagine our IRS being like, "Oh, we'll just take art in exchange for your money." They would never.
It was, but if you think about it, even the government had an interest in assuring that this wasn't a catastrophe.
Yeah.
So
I'm sure they had all sorts of security lined up outside of those houses, so like nobody would steal anything or anything like that either.
And this was, I'm sure that in terms of heft, the government was going to get what it wanted. So I doubt that. I think that these are probably the ones that the government wanted, and if anything, these scales are going to tip in favor of the government.
Yeah.
But just think, potentially 90% in taxes at that time with state taxes.
Yeah.
So these would have been among the most valuable. I'm pretty sure.
That's what I'm thinking too, because the numbers are small. The numbers are very small for 45,000 pieces. They're like.
I'm
not
sure.
even half of that.
And that's the reason I bet the museum today probably has the best works in it, because they took the best works.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is, by the way, is one of multiple Picasso museums around the world. There's not just one. There's one in, is it Madrid? There's one in Spain.
Yeah, there's one in Spain. There's all kinds. There's one in Spain. There's one in Barcelona. I know we have some
Antibes,
we have
Malaga. Malaga's the other one. So there's
yes.
Barcelona and Malaga. Both of those are cities in Spain. And then, meanwhile, these exhibits, just a little bit, we should say a few things to give you a sense of the magnitude of this business today. We've talked about Elvis Presley. That's an example of what ended up being a big industry, the Elvis industry, which has grown, actually, since his death. That's dwarfed by this. I have to tell you, the magnitude of this, I didn't realize when we started researching this. His stuff, his name is branded across the planet. There are movies that regularly seek approval to use in a scene, to use a Picasso, which you can imagine. There are a lot of places where you might want to make that sort of statement.
One was sorry, I just
Titanic?
think it's funny. Yeah, one's the
Tell
Titanic.
that story.
Well, so I'm assuming all of us have watched the Titanic, but
This is the one that was done in the 90s.
Yes.
Right?
In it, Kate Winslet is pulling out a piece of art from a chest, and it is a replica of his Les Mademoiselles painting.
Oh, yeah. Real
which
famous.
is like super famous. And they wanted to use that, and so we'll get into this, but his children formed the Picasso administration, and they're the ones who say, like, yes or no, you can't use that. And they said, no, don't use that. We don't want people to get confused because it's in this museum and they're going to think it sunk with the Titanic now. The directors, everyone, Steven Spielberg was like, okay, like we won't use that. And then they ended up using it. And
so it actually appeared in the movie.
Yeah, so it's in the movie. And so somebody in the Picasso administration just so happened to watch the Titanic, and they were like, that's interesting. And so they did end up settling for a fee. There wasn't any like big litigation over it. But I mean,
it was a big fee.
Yeah, it was
there was
big
a penalty.
Fee. That movie was also huge, so I'm assuming they took what they could.
Yeah, they had no negotiating power. In other words, they were told, they weren't given permission by this organization of the Picasso administration to use it. And that's the one reason the Picasso administration exists, is to police these sorts of things on behalf of the heirs. And they had said no.
Yeah.
And it ends up appearing in this movie. And so the movie, the Hollywood company wasn't in much of a position to negotiate, given that they had already used it wrongfully. So they ended up paying a fee with a substantial penalty.
Yeah, and I bet they honestly were just like, well, we're going to use it anyway, and then whatever happens, happens. But it's even funny now, though, and I need to let you finish your list, but just thinking about all of that pop culture stuff is even lately, there's TikTok, that new app where it's like all videos. People record sounds, and one of the sounds on there it's like, I like it, Picasso. And it's gotten so big that I read the Picasso administration has had to step in, and if you make a sound and it gets really big, you can earn money off of it. Well, they take a fee from that sound now just because his name is used. So anytime anybody uses that, part of the fee goes to the creator, part of the fee goes to the Picasso administration.
And this is happening all over the planet.
Yeah.
So let me set the stage a little bit, then I'll move us forward. The show's ending up to be longer than I thought.
Yeah,
so
we might have to do two parts.
We'll break this into two parts. But so the family now, they figure out how to get the taxes paid. So the heirs now, like it or not, they're partners. And they're partners in an ongoing business. Meaning it's not an option to simply walk away and say, I'm going to sell my paintings and go on, because, Picasso's memory, the value of Picasso as a brand, it's like saying you inherited Elvis Presley, the right to all of the intellectual property for Elvis, and you decide, look, this is going to be a lot of work. I think I'm just going to walk away. I'm going to sell what I have that he owned, and I'm going to move on. Nobody would do that because there were hundreds of millions of dollars if you decide to stay a hold of this tiger by the tail, so to speak. So it was a tiger by the tail that these kids essentially had, meaning it wasn't a pleasant experience, but you couldn't consider ignoring this responsibility that was thrown into their lap. So they had to form a business in which they became partners, an entity. With people with less money, what you'll often do is you'll form a family limited partnership, where each of the family members will be a limited partner, meaning it'll control the amount of vote. They won't vote much necessarily. It's the only way it works is really if they don't vote, but they get full payment. And they're not liable beyond their initial investment. And then they turn over what's called the general partner role to somebody else, to a company that runs it, and then the family limited partnership each gets shares. That's one solution that's used with smaller estates. But in this case, this was massive. I mean, all over the planet, to give you a sense of what's going on, you're having, for example, and this is from 2007, there were 34 Picasso exhibits going on just that year in Bulgaria, France, Germany, Japan, Spain, United States. Meanwhile, you have licenses and trade permits permitted to all these things that have anything to do with Picasso. Think about the entire planet. How often do you see Picasso stuff? Think about when you walk into any museum store after you've toured any museum in the world. Whatever the subject of the museum, you go into the store, and I'm sure you'll see something Picasso tie, Picasso, what used to be ashtrays.
Yeah.
I mean, just all that stuff. We mentioned mentions in movies, pictures that are used to promote different products. There are Picasso cars in France, believe it or not. Some of you know this. Citroën is a massive French company. They have made 2.5 million Picasso cars.
Yeah, they made them from like the 90s all the way up until 2016, 17, I believe.
Yeah.
And then they kind of just changed them over. So I don't know if the family's still involved with them or not, but they just like made like a new version of it.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, they're in like 30 countries.
Yeah.
So, this is just one example. Think of the many, many objects and merchandise and pictures where you might want something to do with Picasso in it. Citroën pays the royalties annually to the Picasso administration, which again, more on that in a moment. Everything from pens, limited edition Picasso fountain pens that have sold for $54,000 a piece. another is any royalty on auction and gallery sales of works. So that's another issue. Is they also have royalties related to sales of art around the world. Something that another responsibility that goes with this inheritance is you've got to look for forgeries and copies. You have to enforce the authenticity of the work, because if you ignore it, then the value of what you own plummets, because you have people around the world who are stealing his stuff and who are copying it and selling it as originals. You have to have somebody to police what's going on online. So all of this technological progress that has happened has actually equipped people who are determined to beat intellectual property regulations. It's allowed them to do that more effectively if you don't police it. So the family kind of limped along for a number of years. They were yoked together, not happily, but it could be worse. It wasn't definitely the worst family fights we've talked about on this show.
No.
So it was functional. Not happily, but functional.
Nobody stole a body.
To their credit, because they really were yoked with each other. There was no remedy for this, and they had at stake $1 billion+. So finally, Claude, this was what I think Claude will be remembered for.
Yeah.
This was the oldest son?
Yes, this was the oldest son.
He was the one who in 96 or in the early 90s, they created Picasso Administration. So Picasso Administration, I guess they use that phrase in France. It would be like, Elvis, what is Elvis's organization? Productions? Or
Yeah. It would be like the Doris Duke Foundation.
Yeah. And except this is for profit.
Yes, yeah.
So they created this organization, and they run it like a business. Claude is the CEO, and they have employees, and their job is to answer requests of movie studios in Hollywood, of Mont Blanc, if they want to negotiate a contract to create a Picasso pen. I mean, it's like Elvis times 10 or 20. I mean, this is international. So these requests are coming from every country in the world related to Picasso. And it should be mentioned that Picasso, I think, is such a legend and so profitable as an image, and not in this century, in part because, yes, his work was great. It was revolutionary. It was original, all those things. But in addition, he was. And he had the advantage of living in an era of celebrity where they could capture and keep his unique personality. I mean, he was a bigger-than-life personality, and he filled the screen. And anytime he gave interviews, which he did, anytime there were videos about his life, which he participated in, documentaries, I mean, he understood PR, and he was a master at it. He was telegenic, and he was very charming, and it's not surprising that he was a ladies' man, though at a glance you'd say, why? But still, he was. And he had this bigger-than-life personality that I think has permeated his reputation and his image, and that affects some of the associations that products and services have, particularly maybe that sort of masculine image, which is considered a little toxic in some ways today. We live in a very different culture in the 21st century. But I will say that one reason that you do have such massive demand for him today is because of himself, in addition to because of his paintings. So anyway, it's a success story. That was not at all obvious. It could have been just a total mess. There could have been litigation still going on, between these kids. There's no one could have said with any confidence that this would have ended the way it has. Right now, the intellectual property rights to this under international law will continue until the year 2043. So at that time, unless the laws are changed, and this is the international law, which France recognizes, that means that after that year, they won't be entitled anymore to the intellectual property payments, to the royalties, et cetera. Now, of course, to the extent they own the art, they own the art.
Yeah.
So it's not a sad situation. I mean, they will have made plenty of money by then.
Yeah, and a lot of them, a lot of pieces from his family have been sold off by his grandchildren, so on and so forth, but because they donated a lot to charity in their wills. But 45,000 pieces, they still have a lot of things.
Yeah. Yeah. And this family is still very wealthy.
Yes.
And I don't know of any debauched cat,
No, I mean, a lot of the Picassos throughout the years, some of them have been adopted, some of them have been born, but all of the heirs and, throughout the family tree, they've all had pretty big families that now get along a lot better, probably just because they've had to learn to.
Yeah, yeah. And it's a big family business that
Yes.
he left. And it has ended happily because they're all very wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
They've all, as you point out, they've done so much philanthropy.
Yes.
They've been very generous. They protect his image and his reputation. The family sometimes still argues, of course, but for the most part, this idea of creating this Picasso administration to run this massive business, and if it's not run, everybody loses the fortune that would have been theirs. So it's done a good job at that. People still, I read in some articles where there are people in the art industry who complain that they have to wait too long for an answer, that they're not real efficiently run, that they should have more employees. He doesn't have a big staff. I think the staff is fairly lean, but still, I mean, it works. It works in terms of defending the reputation. They do help run down these forgers. They do a pretty good job of catching them. Occasionally it happens, obviously, in this day and age, but you've seen prosecutions around the world, in part because Picasso Foundation or Picasso administration has pushed it. And it's in their interest. They've got to be sure that prosecutions happen to set the tone, that there are consequences. So it's
a lot.
It's quite a brand. It's quite a brand. Picasso, there was a while that I was seeing Picasso T-shirts everywhere I go, and they would take something from the Cubist period.
Yeah.
And you would see those everywhere.
I can't even imagine policing that much art. Because if you think about one that's really, really renowned is it's not his, but Starry Night. That's used a lot of different places.
That's an
Van
example.
Gogh's, yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, that probably has tons of policing to go with it too, but that's just one piece. One piece of Van Gogh's pretty small collection. Whereas Pablo Picasso, 45,000 pieces.
Maybe we'll do one on,
More.
I'm a fan of Van Gogh.
I love Van Gogh, yes.
So that could be something, maybe we'll take that up.
Yeah.
It'll be a little hard because he died in 1891, I think. So it's a little hard to do. But that's some of the similar things. And that didn't end as well, though his collection was pretty well curated by his, oddly enough, sister-in-law. Still, it didn't end up as organized nor as profitable as this. So our hats off to how this came out. I'll take a couple minutes and say this. This could have been handled really much better if there had been a trust created. Picasso wouldn't have had to hear the W word, Will. I mean, in other words, if that was the thing in his head, if he had just, with all these professionals around him and his being sophisticated as he was a good financial manager, actually. He clearly could have had a trust created that he would have transferred his art and the authority to that entity. He would have put in place management that could have still allowed his family to participate, but would not require them to suddenly be business partners in the way that they had to. He could have handled this in a way to where there would be money for taxes. There are various ways of dealing with that where you're not hostage as they were to the French government, but in a way, everyone was hostage.
Yeah.
So many things could have been done to have provided the liquidity they needed to deal with taxes in a better way than ended up. But it's a fascinating story. I hope you agree. This was not a boring life nor a boring death. So I'm happy to say, though, that no thanks to Picasso for planning. Everyone has turned out well.
Yeah,
this is one of those unusual stories.
I know, it had a very happy ending, so that made me feel good. I was like, we finally get a decent one.
Good deal. All right, I hope you all enjoyed this and learned something. This has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.